Welcome to Practical Principles, Practical Prince. Today we're talking about action. So last time we talked about actuators and the ability to do stuff and the significance of that being localized with sensation input, because that disconnect really, causes a pretty big breakdown. So now we want to discuss the next steps. That there's you inside of this body, I guess, with fuzzy input and output. You have a fuzzy understanding of the world. You may misjudge it or make mistakes when trying to understand it. And then there's your ability to do stuff, which is also somewhat fuzzy. I mean, for the most part, it's intentional. If I want to say hi, we can do that. But also, if you're exhausted, I'm probably not going to be able to hold up my hand like that because I'll just drop asleep, most likely. So there's a fuzzy relationship between those things. I guess that was the time before. Last time, I think we talked about fate and destiny versus agency. Basically concluding that we might as well err on the side of agency, because if fate is what's happening, if everything is destined, then it's already on those tracks and there's nothing you can do about that. So we now have you get input, a fuzzy understanding, you make choices, and then you act with more or less greater accuracy based on your understanding. Now, that creates kind of a feedback loop, because you'll see what you're doing, or you'll, because you have more senses than just sight. Like the fact that I'm holding this up, I can feel the gravity to a certain extent. So when I say see, I'm not just referring to eyesight and vision. There could be any number of senses involved. But your actions have consequences, which you can then observe, and then that cycles through to subsequent choices you make. Let's also consider that inaction, and I'm sure you've heard this before, inaction, non-action, no choice is still a choice. Because the world doesn't pause for you. It doesn't go on hold. When you take 3 seconds to decide versus a day to contemplate something, your existence doesn't really stop. You're still acting, just with respect to that particular thing. You're delaying, in a sense. But you're still acting in that time. And so I guess just to touch on perfectionism, a lot of people get the misconception that it's like a state of being. But if you really take that, that's like a snapshot. You have this perfect picture of whatever, this perfect thing. And then somehow that snapshot just continues through time. And that's not really how a thing exists, because it continues to be, and it continues to be in the universe as far as we're concerned. I mean, if it were outside, I don't know how we would even be observing it in the first place. So maybe something like that could happen. But as far as what we can observe, you continue to act in a particular way but it's not that snapshot that continues forward, because the universe can still poke and prod, or you might choose to interact for whatever reason. Like if you assume there's a God or some higher power or whatnot, people can call out to that or speak to it, and it may observe and it may act, whether for better or worse. So it doesn't exist in a stasis that's separate. It continues to exist within this connected universe. Because there's, well, as far as I know, you can't really disconnect from the universe. You could try, but you only have like a pseudo success as far as I'm concerned. So you have the actions that you choose to do, some of which you don't necessarily do, because like we talked previously about like the knee reflex and stuff like that. Like your body is mitigating, and that's sort of some of the fuzz. Sort of some of the fuzz in your understanding and your execution. And so I guess what we should probably talk about is, well, I guess what I mean to talk about today is action. And I guess the first thing is, how should you act? Is there a reason to act one way or another? So most of you presumably are like me, and you've got your conscious, which is mitigating this input-output, and it's essentially bonded to this body, which is a vehicle then for it. And I guess our first question in that regard is, do you really need that vehicle? And I mean, I suppose you could argue against that. But I don't know that that's a great line of thinking. It won't be well received at the very least. Because if you say, we don't really need these bodies, they're just cages, prisons, whatever, for the soul, why have them in the first place? I think you naturally get to stuff like suicide, homicide, if you're trying to be benevolent towards others. And yeah, I don't think that's not a particularly good approach. I'm pretty sure it will not be well received. So you have this body that you're bonded with. So you could either go antagonistic, which is kind of what we just described, or you can go for more of a symbiotic, you help each other out sort of thing. And I think we know that the body, because like you don't have consciousness till 3, 4 or something like that. There might be exceptions, but by and large, I think the experience is your body is, and then you come to possess it in a sense. And it might just be that as an infant growing up, your body is still figuring out the controls. Because it's not, I mean, it's pre-programmed in a sense because of the genetic code and whatnot. But then as far as actually using these tools, these digits, for example, like you as a person and being able to control that definitely takes, well, you learned that at some point. And you've probably just distanced yourself from that so much that it's not really conscious. Although now I'm wondering how that compares with breath, because that's semi-automatic. There's a different word a medical word for that. But like, you continue to breathe even when you don't think about breathing. But if you want, you can control your breathing. So there's that semi-automatic there, which is kind of built in. I don't know if that's much different from how the heart pumps blood. It just happens to be something we can take control of more readily, whereas other things seem to weigh on us in a sense. Like, my arm is doing this because I chose to do that. And there's so much that goes into even that simple motion. The adjustment at the wrist, the tendons, what would that be, loosening? And then others contracting to pull this out. And then, like, the fact that the detail here of where exactly it stops moving, which I don't actually care about, I just generally mean here, like, a lot of that, your body has already gotten well adjusted to, so that I can do those sorts of things. So back to the symbiotic relationship I think we want to pursue. And just symbiotic means you help each other out. In the case of the body, like, you can't ignore the stuff it asks for. Like, when it says you're hungry, you can put that off to some extent. At a certain point, that will kill you. Excuse me. And on the flip side, like, you might have a food disorder or something, eating disorder. And so that hunger signal has been abused in a different sense. Not ignored, but overly sensitive to it. And maybe you've just trained other things as well. Because you're probably, we'll set that aside for now. So there's that give and take, which you then moderate. And at a certain point, it makes demands, like exhaustion, you drop. Or, I guess, starvation and stuff could eventually kill you, in which case, I guess the body is, in a sense, revolting? No. It's more like the spirit is ejected, isn't it? Just because it's no longer habitable. And it's no longer usable. And there are cases where people are revived. But yeah, you can't be disconnected for too long, which in the case of some programs makes sense. So there's sort of that natural aspect to that. But that's getting off into a pretty big tangent. But yeah, as part of that symbiotic, you're moderating them, but also it's moderating you. Because, like, that hunger signal in the example will get stronger over time if you continue to ignore it. So there is a relationship there, which you work out for a time. And that's possibly where a lot of excess goes wrong. Or even some, I want to say science, because like some people look for answers that they want rather than what it really is. And I think in some cases they'll have their conscience or whatever indicate wrong, and they'll ignore that because they want that answer for some particular reason. And then, well, they suffer or enjoy the consequences of those choices and actions. So now let's shift into how should we act. And I think we can agree, just based off what we've already talked about, that you don't want to be a slave to the body, but neither should the body be a slave to the inhabitant, the soul. We'll do body and spirit. So definitely you'll need to act in some ways, assuming that we go with that symbiotic approach where you care for the body. And so there's things like finding food to feed yourself, shelter to keep it safe so that you can rest and recover, stuff like that. But that doesn't require like all of your action. There's still this surplus that the spirit can then use the body to do things. I mean, the body using the spirit to get its needs met in the first place with the give and take. And then the flip side, the spirit using the body to get what it wants or needs, whether that be knowledge, experience, stuff like that. But there's definitely more time than what the body needs. So what does the spirit, really have a need in that case? Because that would make sense for how you should act if you've got that, if your spirit has a need. So does the spirit have needs? I mean, you picked up this body. The body has needs. Those are worked out, at least. We know those cases for the most part, and that's largely solved. So what does the spirit need? Or is just the being captain of a body sort of the perk in that situation? Yeah, it might not have an equal sort of need from the body, which if you believe in spirits, and possibly if you believe in an afterlife or consequently pre-earth life, then you would think that the spirit doesn't need a body for whatever reason. We've bonded and we want it. So then, and I think that's largely right. So going along with that, we've still got a substantial amount of time that we can act or we have to act, because you never really stop acting. And the question would then be, how should you spend that time? And is there a right or wrong answer to that? And then obviously, like, what is right and what is wrong? And who really gets to define that? And that's getting into a deeper discussion, because like some naturalists will say that what the body wants or whatever happens, that's sort of like the natural order. But that can kind of be abused. Because that's sort of like the might is right philosophy, which I don't think most people agree with. So yeah, but then I might want to stop there, because we should probably discuss right and wrong and how you would even establish those. Because that's, as far as how you want to act, you want to act in a manner that is right and not wrong, I suppose. I'll need to do some thinking about the right and wrong. So yeah, I think that'll be it for today on action. We'll talk about right and wrong next week. And yeah, so I'll see you Friday for some fun and tarot and talk, assuming people want to talk. Tarot only makes sense if there's questions to answer. And of course, I think tarot is mostly flipping cards, so if we just want to talk and solve some problems just with discussion, I think that would be my preference, but there's a certain appeal to divining an answer, which I can understand. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys on Friday.